Hello, it's Friday the 18th of February and you're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart. A quick programme tonight. Our first story, the latest in the Ukraine crisis. Russia has announced massive drills of its nuclear forces on Friday today as tensions with the West mount over allegations it has some 150,000 troops on Ukraine's border. The Russian Defence Ministry said that President Vladimir Putin would supervise exercises of the strategic forces with the firing of ballistic and cruise missiles. The drills aim to test the state of readiness of the forces involved and the reliability of strategic nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, the ministry said. US President Joe Biden had given a dire warning yesterday, stating that analysts did not see signs of de-escalation. Every indication we have is that they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine, Biden told reporters at the White House. He said the US has reason to believe that Russia is engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in, without going into more detail. Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, told Euronews that Russia could stage a false flag operation in order to justify an incursion over the border. We have seen attempts by Russia to stage an event and then use that as an excuse for launching an attack on Ukraine. And of course that adds to the seriousness of the situation, he said. The Kremlin has repeatedly said it has no plans to invade Ukraine, but has demanded assurances from the West that NATO does not expand to Ukraine or to other former Soviet republics. Moscow announced that it had begun to pull back troops from the border, but the West has questioned this claim, affirming that thousands more troops have actually been deployed. Both sides have accused each other of disinformation. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin, who is in Europe to discuss the crisis, questions recent Russian claims that some troops would withdraw from the border. "We've seen some of those troops inch closer to that border," he said. "We even see them stocking up on their blood supplies. You don't do these sort of things for no reason. And you certainly don't do them if you're packing up to go home." Some are concerned that a possible pretext for invasion could be related to the conflict in the east, which saw shelling by pro-Russian militias and apparent cyber attacks in the last 2 days. Monitors from the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe reported more than 500 explosions before tensions eased in the evening. A Ukrainian militia leader has called on residents to flee to Russia amid the tense military standoff. Denis Pushilin, the head of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, said that the Ukrainian army planned to seize the Donbass by force and that civilians needed to be evacuated. He accused Ukrainian forces of having amassed troops along the line of contact. These claims are denied by the Ukrainian government, and Western journalists reporting from the line of contact say there is no evidence to support any of Pushilin's claims. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Security Council today announced massive drills of nuclear forces on Saturday, tomorrow. The Guardian reports that the dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, may also be present, having already offered to host Russian nuclear weapons in his country. The West is concerned that Russian troops may become a permanent feature in Belarus, which shares a border with Ukraine and could also be used to attack Kiev. And now back to Scotland. According to the latest data from just before the pandemic, a typical household in Scotland had £214,000 in total wealth, similar to previous years. Typical wealth in the wealthiest 10% of households comes to £1.6 million, whereas a typical household in the least wealthy 10% had something like £7,500. The least wealthy households rarely own property or have any private pension savings. Their wealth is mainly made up of the value of their possessions, such as cars, furniture and clothing. Wealth inequality was more severe than income inequality. The 2% of households with the highest incomes had 9% of all incomes, while the same wealthy 2% held 15% of all wealth. Typical wealthy households tend to be those with higher incomes, They tend to be pensioner couples and home owners. In contrast, households with below average wealth tend to be low income, lone parent or single working age adult households and those in rented housing. 3 out of 10 households had insufficient savings to keep them above the poverty line for a month should they lose their income. 4% of households were in unmanageable debt. A third of households did not own any property and a third of adults had no private pension savings. Now, moving on to COVID in England, we hear that scrapping of the COVID tests and isolation periods in England could lead to a rapid epidemic growth as people's behaviour changes more swiftly than at previous times in the coronavirus pandemic. This is according to UK government advisers today. Prime Minister Boris Johnson will outline his plans for living with COVID on Monday, and he has said that he aims to scrap the legal requirement to self-isolate for people who test positive for the coronavirus. Health leaders have urged him not to be so gung-ho, with a survey showing that most believe that he should not scrap the requirement to self-isolate or end free testing. The government's advisory pandemic modelling group, the SPIMO, echoed that caution in easing the rules any further. They said, while behavioural change following the lifting of restrictions has previously been gradual, a sudden change, such as the end to testing and isolation, has the scope to lead to a return to rapid epidemic growth. The SPIMO said in the document, which was dated the 2nd of February but just released today, and it's based on work done by the University of Warwick. The Warwick estimate said that the combination of measures and behavioural changes since before the pandemic, such as testing, self-isolation and mask wearing, had reduced transmission by around 20 to 45%. The estimates indicate there is a potential for transmission to increase by from 25 to 80% if the population were to return to pre-pandemic behaviours with no mitigations at all. Britain has recorded 160,000 deaths from COVID-19, but Prime Minister Johnson has lifted lockdown restrictions as vaccination and the lower severity of the Omicron variant weaken the link between cases and deaths. The SPIMO said that the waning immunity and new variants could act to increase or decrease transmission, and that the growth advantage of the new BA2 subvariant of Omicron could mean that modelling actually underestimates future numbers in hospitals. And now to continue with our story about inquiries into the behaviour of Donald Trump and his family and finances. A New York judge has ruled Thursday, after our broadcast yesterday, that the former US President Donald Trump and 2 of his adult children must answer questions under oath within 21 days in the State Attorney General's civil probe into their family company. Justice Arthur Engoron of the New York State Court in Manhattan ruled in favour of Attorney General Letitia James in directing Trump, his son Donald Jr. and his daughter Ivanka to testify. Judge Engoron said that Letitia James has the clear right to issue her subpoenas and to question the Trumps after having uncovered copious evidence of possible financial fraud. Failing to issue subpoenas would have been a blatant dereliction of duty, wrote the judge. Today, justice prevailed, Attorney General James said in a statement. No one will be permitted to stand in the way of the pursuit of justice, no matter how powerful they are. No one is above the law. The decision followed a 2-hour hearing in which Trump's lawyers accused Letitia James of doing an end run around her client's constitutional rights, saying by seeking testimony she could then use against him in a parallel criminal investigation. Trump's lawyer, Alina Habba, accused Attorney General James of selective prosecution and misconduct that this country has never seen, citing what she called the Democratic Attorney General's vile disdain for Trump, who is a Republican. If he was not who he is, she said, she would not be doing this. Trump, in a statement issued later on Thursday, called the accusations false and accused Letitia James of a political agenda in targeting him and his family. It's a continuation of the greatest witch hunt in history. Remember, I can't get a fair hearing in New York. Last month, Letitia James said her nearly 3-year investigation into the Trump Organization had uncovered sufficient evidence of possible fraud. She described what she called misleading statements about the value of the Trump brand and 6 properties, saying that the company may have inflated real estate values to obtain loans and then reduced the same values to lower the tax bill. The Trumps have not been accused of any criminal wrongdoing. Judge Engoron declined the Trumps' request to put Attorney General's case on hold while the criminal case, led by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, is pending. Letitia James joined that probe last May. The criminal investigation begun by Alvin Bragg's predecessor, Cyrus Vance, resulted last July in tax fraud charges against the Trump Organization and its longtime chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. Both pleaded not guilty. Judge Engoron said the argument that James was trying to bypass grand jury protections, which would give the Trumps immunity by issuing civil subpoenas, completely misses the mark. He said, the Trumps could refuse to answer questions, noting that Donald Trump's other adult son, Eric Trump, invoked his constitutional right against self-incrimination more than 500 times when the Attorney General's office questioned him in 2020. Judge Engoron said the spark for the investigation was not Letitia James' dislike of the former president, but rather testimony from Donald Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, that the Trumps were cooking the books. The judge also noted the Trumps' history of investigations by the Attorney General's office, including significant settlements with Letitia James' predecessors concerning the Trump University and the Trump Charitable Foundation. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump is trying to stop the James investigation. He has not said whether he will run for the presidency again in 2024. The Washington D.C.'s Attorney General is separately suing the Trump Organization and Trump's inaugural committee over the alleged misuse of $1.1 million of charitable funds, with a trial date set for the 26th of September. Excuse me. Meanwhile, further American news. We've heard today that thousands of Texas voters in mail-in ballots for the midterm primaries have been rejected for failing to comply with the new Republican-backed identification requirements passed in the wake of former President Trump's false claims of widespread election fraud, according to county officials. Election officials in 6 of Texas's largest counties, which are collectively home to about 1/3 of the Texas population, are reporting unprecedented rates of invalid ballots, almost entirely because the voters are neglecting to include an ID number on the envelope, which the new law demands. That has officials scrambling to try to help voters correct the errors less than 2 weeks before the state holds the nation's first primary elections, in which the Democratic and Republican voters will choose their candidates for the November 8th midterm elections. These will determine control of the US Congress for the next 2 years. In Harris County, Texas, the home to Houston and 4.7 million people, 3,500 ballots representing about 35% of those received by Tuesday would not be accepted because the voters did not fill in the correct number. In past years, the overall rejection rate has been 5 to 10%. Now it's 35%. The vast majority of ballots appear to have been cast by registered voters who simply made an honest mistake, officials said. These layers don't provide more security, but they are providing more rejection, said Isabel Longoria, the top election official in Harris County. Election administrators are in this very bizarre situation where it's our job to help the voters vote, but we're having to reject ballots at a rate we've never seen before. The number of rejected votes is certain to rise given that the majority of mail-in ballots have not yet arrived at clerks' offices ahead of the March 1st primary. Officials in Dallas County, the state's second most populous with 2.6 million residents, said they were sending back 26% of the mail-in ballots, much higher than in previous elections. In Collin County, a district just north of Dallas with roughly 1 million people, 25% of mail-in ballots were being rejected, according to Bruce Sherbert, who is the county's election administrator. Similar figures are reported in other Texas counties. The findings present an early look at how the wave of new restrictions on voting over the past year, largely passed by Republican-held legislatures, could affect turnout in the November 8th elections. "We've never heard of anything as nearly as high as this," said James Slattery, an attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Law Project. Texas lawmakers approved the voting restrictions last September after a months-long effort by the Democrats to block it. It was one of the many efforts in Republican-controlled states to pass new limits after Trump falsely claimed that he lost the 2020 election due to widespread fraud. When asked about the higher-than-usual rejection rates, Texas Secretary of State John Scott's office referred Reuters to a statement it issued on Wednesday that laid out voters' options for correcting the rejected ballots. One election official in Collin County, however, said that the rejection rates would fall once voters got used to the new requirements. "I think it's going to improve," said Bruce Sherbert at Collin County, noting that the law does give voters who failed to fill out a number an opportunity. It was just a rough start. Meanwhile, in the UK, the elections bill, which also requires voter ID, is making its way through Parliament. The bill will allow the government to meet some of the Conservatives' 2019 manifesto commitments, including protecting the integrity of UK's democracy by introducing an identification to vote at polling stations, stopping postal vote harvesting, and measures to prevent any foreign interference. On its website, the UK Electoral Commission says the UK has low levels of proven election fraud, and there remains no evidence of large-scale electoral fraud in 2019. Okay, and on Parliament again. Today we hear that all party parliamentary groups, the APPGs of MPs, are receiving large donations mainly from private sector companies, according to Chris Bryant MP, who's the chairman of the House of Commons Standards Committee. There are over 700 of these self-policing parliamentary groups, which have been given a reported £13 million from companies from the defence, healthcare or tech or other sectors in recent years. Other donations have come in from charities or trade unions. Chris Bryant MP says, "It feels as if every MP wants to start their own APPG, and every lobbying company sees an APPG as an ideal way of making a quick buck out of a trade or industry body." Mr Bryant recognises that APPGs may offer a way for Parliament to consider issues which it might have overlooked. The groups are chaired by an MP but may be jointly run by representatives of the different lobbies campaigning for issues like cancer research or jazz music, or for countries such as Russia or China. Clearly, conflicts of interest could arise. In these cases, Mr Bryant suggests that the parliamentary authorities should have the power to shut these groups down. Steve Goodrich of Transparency International told The Guardian, "From big tobacco to kleptocratic regimes, there are a plethora of interests behind these groups that remain largely unchecked by formal rules. Without greater transparency over lobbying, much of what happens in these groups will remain behind closed doors." That's that. Now, a Scottish story. We hear today that the Scottish Government's Omicron Business Support Fund will help cultural organisations, events, museums and freelancers to recover from the economic impact of the coronavirus restrictions. £16 million of funding for this financial year is being allocated as follows. There's £12 million to Creative Scotland towards support for a hardship fund for creative freelancers, a recovery fund for cultural organisations and for Edinburgh festivals celebrating their 75th year. Details of these funds will be announced next week by Creative Scotland. There's also £2 million for Event Scotland to increase total support for their international and national events programmes. There will also be £2 million additional support for the Museums Recovery Fund to support a wider range of museums to recover from the pandemic. Culture Minister Neil Gray said, This further £16 million in support for cultural events, heritage and creative industries recognises how much we value these sectors, which have been among the hardest hit by the pandemic. As we embark on our recovery, cultural activity has a pivotal role to play in reinvigorating our economy and communities, as well as promoting individual well-being. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the government has announced more than £240 million for culture and events, and we are continuing to work closely with these sectors as they rebuild audience confidence. Ian Munro, the Chief Executive of Creative Scotland, said, "This additional funding from the Scottish Government is very welcome and will provide a lifeline for many in the cultural sector who have lost income as a result of the ongoing pandemic." Okay, and now finally, can we say a congratulations to Scotland's athletes competing in the Winter Olympics. As we hear, just as we are preparing tonight's programme, we have had confirmation that Eve Muirhead's curling rink are now through to the final of the curling event at the Beijing Winter Olympics. Like the men's team, the women curlers are now going on to win at least a silver medal. We heard already that Bruce Mowatt's team the Americans beat the USA curling team 6-4 to face Sweden in the final on Saturday. The women's team, who also beat Swedish women in the semi-final, now face Japan in their final on Sunday. Bruce Mowat, the skipper of the men's team, is from Edinburgh. The others in his team are Grant Hardy from Dumfries, Bobby Lammy, also Dumfries, and Hammy McMillan, who's from Stranraer. Eve Muirhead, who's from Perth, leads a team comprising Jen Dodds from Edinburgh and Vicky Wright and Hayley Duff, who are both from Forfar. So all the best. Now we're back on Sunday lunchtime with the full Scottish, and so we'll update you on the women's final, and we'll be waiting to hear what happens to the men's final. So good luck to them. And so that's all from Broadcasting Scotland tonight. So thanks for watching, and can I remind you that we are entirely supported by our viewers and subscribers. So if you are one of our subscribers, it's great to have you on board. We do need your money, so if you have any spare cash, or if you know anyone who would like to donate to Broadcasting Scotland, then please look at the funding appeal, which is on our website. We are free to air, we don't do advertising, we don't receive any public funds, and we do have big bills to pay. So if, like us, you think Scotland needs independent broadcasting made in Scotland, then please help in any way you can. And so that's it from me, Hugh Stewart, tonight. So it's the full Scottish on Sunday lunchtime, and I'll be back next week. Thank you for watching. Good night.